Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our Experience Rochester Live lifelong learning series on the future of free speech. I'm Gail Leone, a 1971 graduate of the University of Rochester. Yes, I was at the university during the Vietnam War when protests and free speech were critical issues on campus my entire 4 years. So this topic interests me a great deal. I am thrilled that so many alumni, parents, students, and friends joining us today are also interested in it. I remain engaged as an emerita member of the university's Board of Trustees and a founding co-chair of our Women's Network. And as a practicing lawyer now with Denton's law firm, and previously general counsel of companies like Harley-Davidson and U.S. News and World Report, I've had to advise clients and executive leadership about business strategy, innovation, risk management, and ESG. But in all my work, speech and the culture of communication you create internally and externally have been critical. So I'm particularly pleased to introduce our very distinguished speakers and learn from them. The Experience Rochester Lifelong Learning Series brings the best of the university directly to you, highlighting the extraordinary talent of our faculty experts and renowned alumni and guests. And we have two extraordinary talents with us today. Nadine Strossen is the past president of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, serving a remarkable almost 18 years as leader of that organization. She is a professor emerita of the New York Law School and a senior fellow at FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. She is an internationally acclaimed free speech scholar, author, and civil liberties advocate. In her most recent book on the war on words, she highlighted that the consistent defense of free speech for all speakers and views is not only the principled approach, it is also the strategically sound one. Yes, good. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Joining her for this conversation is David Primo, University of Rochester's very own professor of political science and business administration. David is well known to many of us at the university, even those who are not political science majors. He is a prolific author of academic journals, books, and op-eds in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, which is how I keep up with him. David also manages the Politics and Markets program at the university, which fosters education, research, and debate, encouraging civil dialogue on very difficult issues about the relationship between business and government. In today's environment, you can add challenging issues between universities and our federal government to that list. David previously brought Nadine to the campus for the same conversation, which got rave reviews. So we are so grateful that they are here to offer it again for a much larger virtual audience. So please join me in welcoming Nadine Strossen and David Primo.
Well, thank you, Gail, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to also extend my welcome to all of you. I'm thrilled to be talking with Nadine once again. As Gail mentioned, I brought Nadine to campus on the spring. There was overwhelming demand to have a webinar, and here we are doing it. So I'm really excited about this. And this event is particularly meaningful to me because the ACLU played a big part in how my thinking on free speech developed. So this is a copy I dug out back when Nadine spoke in April. I have this from high school. So I bought this in high school. It's a copy of The Rights of Students, an ACLU book that proved useful when I was in high school in the 90s and meeting with school officials and going to school board meetings to argue in favor of speech rights for students on issues like dress codes and so on. So yes, those of you who don't know me, I was a weird teenager, right? This is not normal teenage behavior, but that's what I was doing. And sort of the die was cast at that point, right? Sort of destined to go on and study the relationship between free speech and campaign finance law, to study and teach a course called Disagreement in a Democratic Society, which I'll say a little bit more about later on in the program. So Nadine, it is a pleasure to welcome you back to campus, this time virtually.
I am so honored to be back. Gail, you have such a distinguished career. I'm really honored and humbled that you are so committed to not only a wonderful university, but the culture of free speech and academic freedom, which it exemplifies so well, especially through David and his marvelous courses and programming. As a sign of respect for your university, I'm wearing one of the two colors, navy blue. And look, I actually found a
Wow.
bracelet that has the canary yellow too. So thanks for having me again.
We love it. We love it. And you and I talked before, and I know that you love audience questions. So we're going to leave plenty of time for those. For those of you in the audience, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll be monitoring those questions throughout the event, and we'll get to as many of them as we can about midway through. But I want to jump right into questions for you that I have, Nadine. And I always like to start from first principles
Mhm.
when I study any phenomenon. So share with us, your perspective on why should we care about free speech? Why does it matter? And I don't mean in some abstract philosophical sense. I mean in our practical everyday life. Why should we care?
I think we tend to take free speech for granted in this country, David, because it is still, for all of the challenges, very strongly protected. If you ever talk to somebody from a more authoritarian country, either now or who has lived there in the past, they would consider that question so obvious that today's students would probably say, duh. I mean, without free speech, we cannot express ourselves, develop our sense of self-awareness and identity. And so that's essential to our own autonomy and development as individual human beings. We could not, without free speech, freely communicate with other people. Think of some dystopian novels such as 1984, where the repression of the government made it impossible for any two people to have a candid conversation with each other. So everybody became alienated and isolated. In a larger sense, in a democratic republic such as ours, free speech is the lifeblood of democracy. We, the people, to quote the opening words of the Constitution, wield sovereign power. We cannot possibly do that without robust free speech to debate and discuss issues, policies, candidates, and officials. And on a university campus, I cannot fail to mention yet another incredibly essential value of free speech, and that is for the pursuit of truth, not only in science, but social science, humanities, philosophy, for that matter, theology and religion. So basically, everything we do as individual human beings, as members of groups of human beings, and as a society and political culture absolutely depends on free speech.
So that sounds, as you know, I'm a big, putting my cards on the table, big advocate for free speech. I am, that sounds all reasonable, right? But yet we continue to see advocates, supposed advocates for free speech on the left and on the right, who say they value free speech, perfectly willing to suppress the speech of people on the other side. This is a bipartisan, it's not bipartisan incident by incident, but there is a bipartisan agreement that free speech for me is important, but free speech for thee less important. Why is it so difficult to? Why is it so easy to believe in free speech or support free speech in the abstract, but then not actually live up to those principles when the rubber meets the road and there's somebody you disagree with and you try to silence them?
You know, David, in my many decades of debating virtually every advocate of every policy that I considered censorial, from right, left, and center, all across the ideological spectrum, the disagreement is only over what speech should be
Mm,
restricted, not
right.
whether it should be restricted. Every single one of them has said, I believe in free speech. I am against censorship. But, and that but inevitably follows for what the speaker considers to be a uniquely harmful or dangerous form of expression. And that's why I'm afraid, going to run out of work. And why, David, I hate to tell you, you were not only weird as a teenager, if you are still trying your best to consistently neutrally defend free speech, even for the thought that you hate and consider dangerous or harmful. Unfortunately, you are still pretty weird.
Well, I guess I'll take that. I'll take that. So let's talk about a specific form of speech that you've written about extensively, and that's the idea of hate speech. So what exactly, right? People say, oh, yes, I believe in free speech, but we should not allow hate speech.
It
What does that
sounds,
mean? Is it is
yeah.
it con- is it not constitutionally protected?
Well, to start with the constitutional law answer and then the underlying reasons for it, the Supreme Court has never recognized a category of hate speech. I'm using scare quotes for that reason, to underscore that it is not a legal concept. The Supreme Court has not said speech that contains certain hateful ideas or insulting or derogatory, demeaning, dehumanizing. I'm using language that is included in the statutes of many other countries. Our Supreme Court has never recognized that speech is unprotected solely because of its hateful or hated content. To the contrary, the Supreme Court has repeatedly reaffirmed with no dissent from any of the justices all across the ideological spectrum that the core, what they call bedrock principle underlying First Amendment free speech, is viewpoint neutrality or content neutrality. Government must remain neutral with respect to the viewpoint, the content, the message, the idea of the speech. No matter how loathsome or loathed it might be, it is not for the government to deprive either the speaker or the audience members of the opportunity to hear it. If we hate the speech, we should refute it. We should rebut it. We should argue against it. We should ignore it, whatever strategy we consider to be most effective. And since you kindly mentioned my book on hate speech, I will display that because the title really says it all, David. Although I think the rest of the book is worth reading too, but
I assigned part of it in my class. So.
hate, why we should resist it with free speech, not censorship. So my bottom line concern as a full-time civil liberties and human rights advocate is to reduce, if not eliminate, hatred, discrimination, stereotyping. But I am convinced, based on history, based on present experience in other countries, that no matter how well intended, laws suppressing speech with hateful content are at best ineffective and at worst counterproductive to actually addressing the attitudes that are the problem, the actions that are the problem. And we have plenty of legal tools and cultural and in other tools for doing that.
So getting to the cultural tools, I want to just briefly talk about well, not briefly. I want to start talking about universities and the question that a legitimate point that could be made is, well, fine, we can't ban hate speech under the First Amendment, but if I run a private university like the University of Rochester, I can say we're trying to build a certain kind of community here, and certain kinds of speech has no place on this campus.
Mm-hmm.
What is there? Should universities be doing that? Should universities say there are lines that just make it too difficult to have, again, a functioning community, and certain kinds of speech are out of bounds?
David, you phrased the question exactly rightly, because you're not saying, do universities have that right? You're saying, should they exercise? But let's make that clear, because a lot of people don't understand that a private institution, including a private university, is not bound by the First Amendment to protect any speech rights or other constitutional rights of members of its community. The First Amendment, along with most of the Constitution, simply binds the government. So that is an opportunity that a private university has to exercise its own rights of freedom of expression and association to define its own community. So the question becomes, should it do so? And with the greatest respect, I would urge no. And this is why so many great private universities, I think without exception, have voluntarily decided to adhere to the same First Amendment free speech and academic freedom principles that they would be constitutionally bound to honor if they were state universities. Most people know the famous University of Chicago free speech principles. The University of Chicago is a private institution, and yet it has set what many consider to be the gold standard for protecting free speech and academic freedom, not because of constitutional compulsion, but because of all the reasons that you and I discussed earlier, for the pursuit of truth, for the education and preparation of our students to participate effectively as citizens in our democratic society, and so forth. Free speech is essential. And also, going back to the flaws of so-called hate speech laws that have been enforced in other countries and that existed in this country before before the Supreme Court started to strongly protect free speech in the second half of the 20th century, given the inherent irreducible subjectivity of the concept of hate and what ideas are hateful and what ideas are harmful or dangerous.
Yeah.
Those codes on a university campus, just as laws in the hands of government officials, inevitably will disproportionately silence unpopular views, dissenting views, views of disempowered and marginal groups on campus. Exactly the opposite of what we're seeking to do through reducing discrimination.
So I want to ask a related question about inequality now. So an NYU professor sort of made this argument that free speech, we can't have really strong free speech principles, essentially because we live in an unequal world where there's differentials in power. And so saying that everybody's on the same playing field isn't true because some people start from a position of power, others are not in power. So it's very easy to tell some faculty member at an elite university that they've got free speech rights, but how does that or a billionaire, they have free speech rights, but does that somehow, should we somehow counteract those speech rights because there are people who don't have that level of visibility where they have that platform. And so therefore we need to suppress their speech a little bit in order to ensure that the voices of others get heard. I mean, this is an argument we often hear for the justification for campaign finance laws, for instance.
Exactly. And I could go on, but out of respect for the audience, I'll try to be as brief as possible. Actually, you touched on this book the subtitle is 10 Arguments Against Free Speech and Why They Fail. And my co-author, Greg Lukianoff, the head of FIRE, who is also constantly speaking about free speech, he and I put together answers to the arguments that we hear over and over and over and over again. We never get tired of answering them, but we thought we might as well, put the answers in writing. And the question that you just asked, David, is definitely among the most common and answered in the book, if anybody wants more detail. But in a nutshell, it is precisely those who lack political power, who are most in need of and most dependent on robust free speech rights. By definition, they lack majoritarian political power. So the only tool they have available is protest and petition and demonstration and persuasion. And you look at the history of every movement for social and economic justice and equality in the United States or around the world, they have all depended on robust free speech. And conversely, the government has tried to censor them out of existence. So going going back to the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, we had the abolition movement before that, but in the 20th century, we have the anti-war protesters starting, and every war starting with World War I, agitation for labor rights, advocates for women's suffrage and for reproductive freedom, opponents of Jim Crow and the civil rights era, anti-Vietnam War demonstrators. Gail, you and I had that in common. We really depended on robust free speech. And ultimately, for all of these positions, the gay rights movement, on and on and on, what had started as a minority position with no support from the powers that be in government or the private sector, ultimately the power of persuasion brought about change. I do agree with this observation, which was part of your excellent question, David, that some people have more access to more effective free speech than others. Some of it is because of economic inequality. Some of it, quite frankly, is for other reasons. Some people are better speakers. Some people are less shy than others. Some people are more technologically adept. And that this is a challenge in our country with respect to every single right, unfortunately, is more meaningfully exercised by some people rather than others. And the answer is not to reduce the right of those who are more actively exercising it, but to do everything we can to equalize the resources and the opportunities of those who are less privileged. And let me give you the most dramatic example: the right to life itself. I think studies consistently show that the death penalty, which still is enforced in this country, is enforced unequally. If you control for hundreds and hundreds of other factors, the most salient factor is how wealthy the defendant is. Not to disparage at all public defenders, but they are overworked, under-resourced. And so those who can afford a dream team are much more likely to escape conviction or to escape the death penalty or execution. The answer is not to reduce rights of people who are accused of crime, but to increase the availability of excellent lawyers with enough time and enough other support. So in the realm of free speech, it's so important to give everybody at the earliest ages of education knowledge of technology, experience in speaking and discussing, and that continues to be important. David, your courses on equipping young people to actually make a meaningful, constructive, impactful use of their free speech. This is a continuing commitment on the part of all of us.
And that's a great actually segue into what I wanted to ask you about next. Among the many things I want to ask you about, this is one I want to make sure I get in. We've heard a lot about universities clamping down on speech in the wake of the protests over the war in Gaza. Our universities, no exception. And we may come back to that specific topic in a moment. But I wanted to think about, we're talking about universities or institutions silencing speech. But what about this other problem that I've noticed in my teaching and I've noticed on campuses? So this isn't an epiphenomenon. It's a real thing, which is students who self-censor. My office, I like to joke, is sometimes like a confessional booth. People will come to my office and admit that they are conservative or that they voted for Donald Trump. And I'm like, well, why
admit as if it's a crime.
And why don't we talk, why don't you talk about this in class? Well, I can't talk about this in class. And I'm like, okay, so it's clear to me students fear saying the wrong thing, right? And that really stifles classroom debate, and it sort of sets the stage for, right, the rest of their lives. And so just today, in this morning's Chronicle of Higher Education, was an article about programs like Dartmouth's Dialogues and NYU's How We Engage that aim to teach students how to disagree better. And as you just alluded to, I try to do this in my own class, Disagreement in a Democratic Society. But even as I'm a big proponent of teaching those tools of disagreement, I still wonder, and I ask the students this in my class, we can teach these principles of effective disagreement all day long. We can create classes, we create seminars, do orientations. But if I'm in my late teens, early 20s, frankly, if I'm in my late 40s, hypothetically, and I fear social rejection, right? How can any of these tools be put into effective practice?
This is such a difficult question, David, and I'm going to extrapolate it far beyond you to underscore that your personal experience has been demonstrated in survey after survey after survey to be completely typical, not only of students, not only of faculty, but indeed even of tenured faculty members. You are a reader of the Chronicle of Higher Education, so you saw that recently there was a cover story about why are professors so afraid. And they are all of us. When I say us, I'm referring to those of us in the campus community. But by the way, I should say for your other distinguished alumni who are so appreciatively participating in this webinar, surveys show that the same problem exists in the broader society, that members of the public in general are engaged in self-censorship, not for fear of government punishment, with one exception, with the Trump administration's brutal crackdown on immigrants based on their expression or their ideas. People who are non-US citizens, including those who are lawfully here, have, unfortunately, reason to fear governmental punishment. And we've seen tragic examples of people being arrested and deported because of something they wrote or something they said. But putting that extremely important and disturbing exception aside, the vast majority of us who are American citizens and even who are protected by tenure, not to mention protected by professors such as you, David, who nurture robust discourse, they are afraid, we are afraid of other students. And by the way, faculty members are mostly afraid of students, not of their faculty peers. So how do you counter that peer pressure? What I'm doing is underscoring the question. I recognize I'm not answering it, but to underscore what a significant question this is, I want to remind people of something that I had to be reminded of about 10 or 15 years ago, that John Stuart Mill's classic defense of free speech on liberty, which I had read many times and thought of as a defense of free speech. And I had in my mind the government as the major threat to free speech. But Mill says at the beginning and throughout that his major focus of concern is not government censorship, but rather social pressure, cultural pressure, that he said for most people in most situations has a more severe and meaningful repressive impact. And how do we change culture? David, that goes beyond my legal expertise. I think that's a matter for anthropologists and social psychologists. But that's why I so value somebody such as Rochelle, who is going to soon be participating in this program, who, when she was a student, with another student, saw this problem on campus and started taking steps to address it. And on campuses all around the country, indeed at the high school level as well, I have observed a wonderful flourishing of students who are forming clubs, who are seeking opportunities for conversation, who are seeking to change the culture among their peers. And it has to be done very much on a retail basis, conversation by conversation. But I am enormously encouraged by this development. You know, we in the ACLU, we used to talk about grassroots movements and grass tops. So you and I can be, and Gail can be like the grass tops, but we have to encourage the grassroots and understand that we can provide guidance and encouragement and mentorship, but they have to do it themselves. And that's a great practice for being an active participant in as a democratic citizen. Nobody can do it for you. You learn by doing. You create the culture, and you also create the political community and power structure.
So I'm finishing up a project with Fire on faculty diversity in the academy, and I wonder, and we're going to go to Q&A from the audience in about 2 minutes, by the way. So anybody who with additional questions, please put them in the Q&A box. But I struggle with this idea of what, how do we encourage or how do we increase viewpoint diversity in academia, because the data I've got and the data that others have just is incontrovertible that there is sort of a monoculture on college campuses, and that has to be affecting the science that gets done, that has to be affecting the teaching that gets done, no matter how neutral people try to be, because we all bring our own perspectives to the problem. And so how should universities be thinking about dealing with this problem? I don't think you're going to argue that we need quotas for conservatives or libertarian voices in academia, but should universities be actively doing something to try to diversify the pool of faculty in terms of their viewpoints?
Absolutely. And I should say, since I said something critical about Trump policies, first of all, I and the ACLU are strictly nonpartisan organizations. We criticize or praise on an issue by issue basis. And every single government official, in my experience, has had some positives and some negatives. For civil liberties. And on the Trump administration positive side, I think that many of the goals that the administration is seeking by way of reforming campuses are goals that have been advocated for for many years by myself and members of organizations such as FIRE, and also, and this is the one that's most relevant to your great question, David, the Heterodox Academy, which was founded slightly more than 10 years ago by a number of social scientists, including Jonathan Haidt, is probably the best known social psychologist at NYU. And they did it not out of some abstract commitment to free speech. They did it because their empirical studies had demonstrated that the social psychology and other social scientific research was not as good as it could have been had it been subject to a more rigorous peer review process that involved perspectives of people with different ideological orientations. So it was specifically to improve the university's truth-seeking mission. That Heterodox Academy was founded, as its name suggests, and the tagline I love, because great minds don't think alike. And I agree that, so I agree with one of the major goals of the Trump administration that they announced in their efforts on campus is to increase viewpoint diversity. I strongly disagree with the means, because I think when you have government quotas and government monitoring, it's just going to substitute one form of preferred orthodoxy for another. And strategies that have been proposed, first of all, include, this will sound very straightforward, but we can't take it for granted, not allowing ideological discrimination against conservatives or libertarians, or for that matter, classical liberals, because studies have been done not only in this country and others where academics proudly say, yes, we would discriminate in hiring somebody or tenuring somebody or accepting an article for publication in a journal if we disagree with that person's political perspective. That's low-hanging fruit, but unfortunately, there's a lot of it that absolutely has to be cut. Another thing that can be done fairly easily is to have team teaching, so that every course would be taught by professors with different perspectives on the issues. And that might mean, recruiting, visiting faculty members from other institutions. Another really important strategy, which can be accomplished much more quickly than the more time required process of repopulating the ranks of the faculty, is by really making sure that the curricula, the syllabi in every course reflect diverse viewpoints. John Shields and a couple of his colleagues at Claremont McKenna College used a data bank that has like millions of syllabi and studied it to show that in course after course, the leading text that has a progressive perspective is taught, but without any texts that have respected critiques of those leading works. So let me just give one example. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, a great book about, police abuse and racial discrimination. And John himself and his colleagues praise the book, and they say, of course, it should be included. But there are a couple other works that have also been written by progressive African American scholars who are deeply committed to eradicating racial injustice and promoting due process in policing. And they have very valid, strong critiques of Michelle Alexander's work, and yet their books are never included on the syllabi. So this is the kind of reform that could be implemented at hopefully at the departmental level, if not at a higher level within the university itself.
Yeah, I do wonder about, there's always this, when you go back to making policy for universities, there's this concern about who's gonna, something I always think about with campaign finance too. All these rules or all these sort of oversight means you trust the overseers. And we have good reason to be mistrustful of overseers in general. Or maybe I'm too cynical. I don't know.
You're not. Civil libertarians we're mainly litigating and advocating against the government. There's a healthy skepticism about government, and I think it's no coincidence. I'm going to quote my dear departed friend Antonin Scalia that campaign finance reform sounds good, but they often function as Incumbent Protection Act. Well, who's passing the laws? The incumbents. But that's another topic.
We'll do a different webinar, and if there's demand, we'll do another webinar on money in politics one day. But for now, I want to shift gears to the audience Q&A, because you and I could talk for the rest of the afternoon. So I want to bring on a special guest here, which Nadine alluded to. So I decided it would be great to have a U of R alum help me sort through the many questions that have come in. We won't be able to get to all of them. I apologize in advance. So I'd like to introduce her right now. Rochelle Sun is a 2019 graduate of the U of R. She's currently a PhD student at the government department at Harvard University studying health diplomacy. Okay, I have to get my Harvard joke in. I forgive you for going to Harvard for graduate school. I went to Stanford. I forgive you. So quick story about Rochelle. She never took a class with me while at Rochester. But she and another student, Nick Fody, reached out to me in 2018 because they said, look, we like having these discussions about politics, but we don't seem to notice anybody else wanting to have discussions about difficult issues on which they disagree. Is there a way we can do more of this on campus? And they knew that this was something I was interested in. And so that's sort of why I like my job, right? Well, I love my job, right? I get to work with entrepreneurial students who do things like this. Just reach out to me and say, we'd like to do something. I said, well, why don't we do a Meliora weekend event? So we did a major Meliora weekend event around the question of free speech on college campuses. And I like to think we were doing that event before talking about that question was cool. And that event, and then sort of my talking with them over the years, I think I can draw a direct line between that and the creation of my course, Disagreement in a Democratic Society. So I owe Rochelle a great deal of a great debt for that. Rochelle, it's nice to see you. Welcome back to Rochester virtually.
Thank you so much for including me in this event, Dave. Even though Nick and I helped start this conversation with you years ago, you definitely deserve the credit for continuing the conversation at Rochester, especially after Nick and I graduated in 2019. So it's really heartening to see how much the programming has grown, and with your course and these high-profile events, and this discussion is a perfect reflection of that progress.
Oh, thanks. And I start to feel old now when people tell me when they graduated. It's one of the perils of getting a little bit older, I suppose. But I thought it'd be good for you maybe to kick off with the first question from the audience, and then you and I can work off screen for the remaining questions. Sound like a plan?
That sounds great.
If I can make a suggestion, maybe we could take 2 or 3 questions at a time. So that will be kind of a self-censorial tool for me, not because each question I'm sure could elicit a very long answer.
Sure. So I'll start with the first audience question to highlight, which is, how has the interpretation of the principle of free speech changed over time? This question gave ACLU's defense of the KKK as a controversial example of the organization's history of free speech advocacy. So how has our understanding of free speech evolved, and should our conception of free speech change as social and political context change? I'll leave you with that first, and then we can go to another set.
Okay, well, I mean, this question really gets to the heart of free speech law, which, as I said earlier, is viewpoint neutrality, which the Supreme Court has consistently, strongly protected, starting in, I would say, the 1970s or so. And one of the classic cases that epitomizes this robust commitment to freedom, even for the thought that we hate. That's a quote from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes early in the 20th century, but that was in dissent. It did not become part of the majority view until, as I say, the late 1960s, early 1970s. The ACLU's most famous or infamous case, depending on your perspective, as the question alludes to, is the so-called Skokie case, originating from Skokie, Illinois, a city near Chicago, this was in the late 1970s, had not only a large Jewish population, but many of them were Holocaust survivors. And, it was an easy case for the ACLU to win in the courts of law when Skokie tried to silence these Nazis to suppress their demonstration. We won in every court with one exception, the lowest level of court in Chicago, but we went all the way up the federal and state court system to the U.S. Supreme Court, which, reaffirmed this tried and true viewpoint neutrality principle. But in the court of public opinion, it was extremely controversial, even to the extent that card-carrying ACLU members who believe so strongly in free speech said they had that repeated word that I referred to earlier. We believe in free speech, but the one exception we want to make is for Nazis. And, after the ACLU won that lawsuit, there continued to be very strong debate, as a result of which many members did rejoin upon reflection, and many new members joined, saying you really are being consistent and neutrally defending speech, even for speech that is antithetical to civil liberties. There's a very timely connection that I'd like to underscore here, Rochelle, which is that the executive director of the ACLU at the time was a human rights hero named R.E.A. Nyer, who went on to become the founding executive director of Human Rights Watch and the founding executive director of Open Society Foundation. He's one of the giants worldwide in human rights. He was himself a Holocaust survivor. He was born in Germany in 1937. His parents, as Jews, tried to come to the United States. It's a long story. The United States wasn't letting in Jews, but ultimately they got here. And after the Skokie case, he wrote a remarkable book called Defending My Enemy, in which he set forth, drawing on his personal experience, political experience, why, especially those of us who loathe Nazism and who cherish human rights, have to defend free speech. And this book is a classic that was just republished by the New Press. Because exactly as the question indicates, the argument is more timely than ever. REA kindly invited me to write an afterword. And the foreword, this is really significant. It goes to one of your great questions too, David. The foreword was written by Eleanor Holmes Norton, a Black American female civil rights activist. She was the first female chair of the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission. When she was a student, Gail, she was involved in SNCC and, all of the racial justice organizations, as well as anti-Vietnam War protesting. And she's now been the representative of the District of Columbia in Congress for many, many years. And she continues to be so proud of she personally represented George Wallace, the pro-segregationist governor of Alabama. He was supposed to speak in New York City. And the liberal Democratic mayor of New York, see, I told you these violations cross party lines. John Lindsay, some of a certain age will remember that name, canceled the permit for George Wallace to speak at Yankee Stadium. And Eleanor Holmes Norton went to court and defended it. And she explains that it is precisely members of movements such as the civil rights movement that were going to be the ultimate beneficiaries of these strong speech protective principles because their views are the minority view and are the feared view and even the hated view in many contexts. So see, I told you that each question can get full attention because, First Amendment law and principles are so wonderfully intertwined that each question can kind of be a way of tunneling into a whole constellation of principles.
Yeah, so I'm looking here at the questions that have come through from that Rochelle's helping me with here, and so I guess I want to turn to this idea of letting the and I don't know how you're going to feel about this, but sort of helping turn up the volume on the moderates and turn down the volume in the extremists. So
Yeah.
if we think about social media, right? What does social media do? By definition, these algorithms amp up the those who have the most extreme views, and somebody who writes this middle of the road thing, probably that's not going to get as many followers, as many likes, and so on. So you have the social media problem that sort of de-emphasizes moderates. In politics, right, the incentive structure now for a variety of reasons is to be extreme, and we sort of see it in Congress where there's almost no middle left anymore. And so I guess the question is, what should we be doing to, and a third piece of this, sorry, what I want to get in just based on the work that I've read on this is that that the real divide people say in American politics is between people who are sort of, again, extreme in their orientation toward others, and nasty toward others, and those, again, who just want to just have a reasonable conversation. And again, those who are allowed drown out those who are not. How do we solve that problem where there are many reasonable conversations we could be having that don't get had because the loudest voices in the room, the most extreme voices in the room, drown out the middle?
Yeah, this is a very serious problem. And I think the political problem in Congress is much more significant than the media problem that you started with. So let me deal with the media aspect of it first. It is true that social media algorithms incentivize more extreme voices. I think I just read that Oxford Dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary, chose as the new word of the year, as they do every year at this time, rage bait, which refers specifically to an expression that is likely to stimulate rage and that is amplified on social media. But to put this in a historical context, we have to realize this has always been true. The legacy media back in the day famously there was an observation about them, which they acknowledged. If it bleeds, it leads. David, you wrote a whole book about distorted media coverage of plane crashes, right? My husband is a pilot. He's a big fan of that book. You don't hear about the 99.99% of flights that don't result in any accident at all. So there's something in human nature and human psychology that is attracted to outrage and to scandal and other negative things. But not all of us succumb to that, and many of us are making constant efforts to counteract it. We've talked about some of those efforts. In addition, there are a multiplicity of new organizations that have been springing up that emphasize precisely the distorted view we have of who believes what in this country by focusing on who's getting media coverage. I think the best known example that I'm familiar with is an organization called More in Common. It's based, I believe, at Dartmouth, several other universities, serious social science. And they published a path-breaking study a few years ago called Hidden Tribes, which show that most Americans are what they call, I think, disaffected moderates. And then there are about, I think, 8% on one end of the spectrum and maybe 10% on the other, who are getting a disproportionate amount of attention. And what's really interesting is each side exaggerates the views of the other side and how extreme they are, and also exaggerates how much they think that the other side dislikes them or fears them. So there's really good news there. I mean, you can't be an activist without being an optimist. And I think the good news is we're not really so divided. We're not really so polarized. There is a great hunger for dialogue and negotiation and moderate constructive solutions. But our political process, David, you're much more of an expert here than I am, but our political process imposes some obstacles through the gerrymandering and through the primary system. And, periodically in our history, we've had to have constitutional amendments to deal with the problematic government structures. I think that may be what we have to resort to.
Okay. So you keeping on this social media theme and adding in now AI, because I feel like you can't do anything at a public event these days without mentioning AI. So this is our requisite mention of AI. So we have a great question here that came in about this idea that now that we have social media, now that we have AI, at what level do we say, okay, maybe we need to be doing something about the problems of misinformation, the problems of conspiracy theories, and is that something we need to be thinking about? That in the era we can have deep fakes, in the era where AI can create really, really, really sort of lifelike videos of someone, do we need to be clamping down on that kind of speech? Is there a line we need to be drawing here?
Well, I think that, certainly the example you gave and other examples that have been brought to my attention, because of course, I follow this area with avid interest, can be dealt with under existing laws. So if you have a defamatory representation of somebody, or if you have a non-consensual sexual image of somebody, or you have an image that is invading somebody's privacy, that is already illegal under tort law principles and under criminal law principles. And so we simply need to enforce those pre-existing laws in the AI context. As with every communications medium, it can do great harm as well as great good. But let us remind ourselves that even well-intended government regulation can do great harm as well as great good. And in fact, the courts have already struck down some predictably overly broad, overly vague regulations of AI that probably were well-intended, but that swept so broadly that they're cramping the enormous potential of AI to bring great benefits to society. But we really have to be proactive in developing not only regulatory responses, but proactive in designing the technology to maximize its positive pro-human potential. And here, there are a number of initiatives. One that I'm very excited about was undertaken jointly by FIRE and an organization whose name I'm sorry, I'm going to forget. It's a small organization of computer scientists and philosophers, a combination that first struck me as unusual, but I'm learning that it's not that unusual, who offered seed grants to AI developers to come up with programs that were designed to use AI in a way that would foster access to accurate information, foster fact-checking, foster free speech, foster vigorous dialogue, recognizing that AI tools can definitely do exactly the opposite. And the first round of awards were announced this summer. They were just amazingly creative, inspiring, encouraging initiatives from young scientists from around the world. And there's actually going to be a conference in Austin, Texas this month where they're showcasing these products. In the realm of civil discourse in class, one AI program that was developed by Simon Cullen, who was at Carnegie Mellon, now he's at the Heterodox Academy, is called Sway. And it was a tool to foster constructive dialogue on a student-by-student basis and to replicate the efforts of a dedicated individual teacher, such as yourself, David. There's only a limit to how many students you can make yourself available to. And so I think, we should recognize that there are potential dangers, but there are potential great benefits, and we have to be proactive in pursuing the latter.
And so we have time for one more question before we need to start wrapping up. I think it's gonna be one more question. We're trying to combine multiple questions into one. So some of you in the audience think, well, you didn't ask my question. Well, we sometimes did just by weaving it into another question. So I'm just going to read here the question as Rochelle has put it together. So some argue that certain forms of speech constitute violence because it can be harmful, insightful, or threatening. That's been the basis we've used to cancel events that bring speakers with controversial views to college campuses. I want to add in another question that was asked about conversion therapy, that some states ban conversion therapy for LGBTQ individuals, youth. And the idea, right, is that speech, because therapy is just speech, is by definition harmful, which is sort of in the same bucket with violence. And I guess the question is, should we be thinking about speech in the context of harms? And if so, and violence, and if so, is that a justification for saying, okay, that's where our line is going to be? Not actual physical violence, but even just the words themselves are intrinsically, right, violent, regardless of whether they lead to a physical act. So should we be regulating that sort of, this is distinct from hate speech, right? Because here there's an implicit threat, if you will, or an implicit harm, even if it is not directly, 100% linked to the words.
Great,
nice, easy question to end
great on. Interrelated questions, and I apologize in advance. I'm not going to be able to do justice. Again, several questions and arguments in this book are woven into that one. And starting with, so Greg and I picked the 10 most common arguments that we kept encountering, and we ranked them. And I mean, we had pre-written something like 25, and we picked the top 10. And number one, David, you hit. Words are violence. And we each wrote different answers, but in essence, words are the antithesis of violence. Attributed to Sigmund Freud is the observation that civilization began the first time that a human being responded to an argument by hurling words rather than rocks. So think about it, negotiation, mediation, debate, discourse. These are ways of resolving conflicts that do not involve physical violence. To be sure, mere words can cause great harm, great emotional harm, psychological harm, which may well even have physiological manifestations. So another false argument against free speech is, oh, you people who defend free speech, you deny that speech does any harm. Not true. And let me quote the most important defenders of free speech, the United States Supreme Court justices, who, for all their other ideological disagreements, are very, very much in consensus across that whole spectrum in defending freedom for the most controversial speech that many American citizens want to suppress, including hate speech and extremist speech and disinformation and so forth. And in a case in which the Supreme Court upheld hateful speech that was accused of causing emotional trauma, psychological harm with physiological manifestations, the court said, we defend free speech not despite the fact that it can cause great harm, but precisely because of that reason. Speech is powerful, and it is a power that can do great harm as well as great good. But we have decided as a nation that it is more harmful to empower the government to pick and choose which speech is sufficiently harmful that it should be suppressed. So that's a part of the equation that is usually left out. David, you referred to the book by Jeremy Waldron, Advocating Censorship of Hate Speech. The title of that book was, I've debated Jeremy many times. I respect him, although I disagree with him. The title of the book is The Harm in Hate Speech. Yes, there is harm in hate speech, but his argument starts and ends with that. He doesn't address the harm in giving government this inevitable discretion that inevitably will be wielded disproportionately against minority voices and views by empowering them to censor it. So if you want a more extended answer, please look at The War on Words, or please invite me back.
Well, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. And I just to build on your last point in 10 seconds, I would just note that, my thought experiment to students always is, if you think something should be regulated, tell me if you still think it should be regulated if the person you like least or trust least is the one doing the regulating. And that usually makes people think twice about, do we want to give government, or do we want to give a university president or a provost or a committee of faculty this kind of power to regulate speech? So I want to end on a very quick positive note. I want to thank you, Nadine, and I want to highlight what you said earlier about the fact that there are so many students, there are so many faculty, there are so many Americans who do want to have these conversations. And I'm really lucky that I get to have them in my classes. And so that is sort of there is some hope here. And I think it is just a matter of continuing to advocate for more dialogue and more light and less heat sometimes in our conversation. So thank you again. It's been a pleasure speaking with you once again. And I think we need to turn it back over to Gail to wrap up. So thanks again, Nadine.
Many, many thanks to you, David.
Great. Thank you both, and also thank you, Rochelle. For a moment, when Nadine was talking about On Liberty, I had flashbacks to Professor Bloom's political philosophy class. This was really a wonderful reminder, I think, to all of us. First, not to take free speech for granted, about the importance of the power of persuasion, which is critical. And it's incumbent upon all of us, I think, to do everything we can to give everyone the right to speak, but to equip people to speak. I think that the conversation you have, David, is really important about how do we create a civil dialogue. Maybe the answer is in teaching civility, who knows? But turning up the volume on the moderates may have something to do with that as well. But
and teaching how to listen as well
how to
as
listen,
how to speak.
exactly, which is as important as speaking. Exactly. Civil dialogue. Be good. To all who joined us, thank you very much for being here and for being active members of the Rochester community. This is an incredibly exciting moment for the university as we launched our Forever Better, our ambitious, comprehensive fundraising and engagement campaign this fall. The campaign is about strengthening our community, all of our members, and building a network of people who are proud to champion the university. And Forever Better is also a call to our community. You can help by engaging in 4 ways. The first is go. We hope to see you at future events, including one of our Forever Better campaign celebrations or annual holiday gatherings, and consider inviting your friends along. You can help by giving. Support what matters to you most with a gift of any amount to an area of the university, the medical center, the Eastman School of Music. Help volunteer as an admissions ambassador or career connector, or join our lifelong learning and advisory council to help plan events just like this one. And to connect, be an advocate for Rochester, keep up to date by reading university news and sharing with community. The Women's Network is one of those. Each of you can have an impact in your own way. You'll receive a brief survey as we end this webinar, and we welcome your feedback. Please let us know topics you would like to see featured at future Experience Rochester events. That would be terrific. Maybe one should be on money and politics, as you said. Thanks again for attending, and Meliora. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.